Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what's the third in a series of 5 30-minute webinars that we've been running, exploring a number of themes on whistleblowing. If you've missed the first two, you can still register online and watch the recordings. And the next one, should you like to register for it, is next Thursday at the same time, where we'll be talking about how to effectively manage your investigations. So in the first two sessions, we explored the impact and implications of the EU Whistleblowing Directive on organisations in both the EU and the UK. This week, we're taking a practical look at the process of choosing and implementing a new whistleblowing system. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Rachel Pinckheard, Group Internal Audit Manager at Irish Fintech company Fexco. Welcome, Rachel. Thanks very much for joining us. By way of introduction, I'll ask Rachel to introduce herself in a second, but by way of introduction, my name's Andrew Breakwell, and I'm Commercial Director for EQS Group in the UK, where we provide a range of digital compliance solutions to organisations of all sizes. As I say, I'll ask Rachel to introduce herself shortly. Although we've a relatively short amount of time today, these are 30-minute webinars, we'd really welcome your participation. So we've allowed time towards the end of the session to address any questions you may have. As any questions come to mind as we go through the webinar, please enter them into the panel, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to these, as many of them, as we can at the end of the main discussion. Any we can't get to, we'll try and answer to you directly. So, Rachel, perhaps we can start by asking you to introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about Fexco and also your role and responsibilities within the company.
Thanks a million, Andy. I suppose about myself first. My background is that I qualified as a chartered accountant and tax consultant. I worked in practice for a number of years, and then I moved to Fexco in 2011. I'm a big fan of continuous education, so I've done other exams during my time with Fexco, a certificate in compliance, a diploma in data protection, and a diploma in forensic accounting. My role is Group Internal Audit Manager, so I suppose my main responsibility is to plan and execute audits that provide the board with assurance that the controls within the organisation are designed and operating effectively. Fexco, I could talk about Fexco for an hour, but given the time constraints, just in summary, Fexco are an Irish-based and Irish-owned fintech multinational. It was founded in 1981. It was initially had a bureau de change business. That business is still in existence, but the number of other businesses within the group have expanded to include both regulated and unregulated businesses, payments businesses, managed services, leasing businesses. There's over 2,300 employees. We do business in about 48 countries, and we've operations in 29 countries. And it's Ireland's largest privately owned financial services firm, and we're headquartered in the southwest of Ireland, County Kerry.
Thanks, Rachel. So Fexco, I know, introduced a new whistleblowing system last year, I believe, and you were sort of instrumental in that process. So can you just explain to us and the audience what you had in place previously and what prompted you to consider a change?
We originally had a third-party hotlines, phone hotlines, and the reason we looked at changing the system was we did an overall, at the start of the pandemic, we did an overall supplier review across the group in terms of whether all suppliers were fit for purpose and whether we were getting value for money. And the whistleblowing system ended up landing on my desk, and I looked to see whether it was working efficiently. And one of the first things I did was contact them to see how many calls we had gotten historically, because I wasn't aware of any. And it turned out we hadn't gotten any. So I reached out to some peers and said, you know, is that the norm? And I was quickly told, no, you should have had some calls over the last couple of years, even if they turned out not to have merit in them. So then I reached out further to individual business heads and said, are you aware that the whistleblowing system exists? And have you been using it? And we found some anomalies. Like I said, we're a global company. And in New Zealand, we have a Western Union business, payments business out there that operates from Tonga, Fiji, and places like that. So my understanding was that the phone line was originally chosen because it would be great in those kind of countries that they could reverse charge to the hotline and leave messages. And it turned out that maybe that was the case was when it was introduced, but as time went on, it wasn't possible to reverse charge numbers, and there were no toll-free numbers. So it turned out that they weren't using the system at all. They had implemented a workaround where it was in the policy to contact particular members of senior management if you had an issue. So on that basis, we thought it would make sense to look at what else was out in the market that would fit what we required.
And what was the process you went through in choosing the system?
Again, I think peer recommendation is always useful. You know, it's good to be involved in various networks where you can get recommendations from your peers. But we also spoke to individual risk and compliance officers in business units, saying what their requirements would be, what they would need. In some areas, there wasn't a requirement. In New Zealand, there wasn't a requirement to have an anonymous whistleblowing system, but we felt it was best practice to have that in place. So I had spoken to other firms where they said they surveyed employees to see, you know, were they aware of the system and would they feel safe using it. We didn't do that at that stage. We just spoke to individual business managers and said, what would you need? What would work in your area? And we put together a list of requirements. And then, to be honest, between that and the recommendations, we set up demos with a number of firms to see what would work best for us.
And you chose a digital platform, I believe.
Yeah.
So you dropped the telephone component of that?
Dropped the telephone component, not just because of the experience in New Zealand, but from feedback from other people, it did appear that phone lines aren't the kind of preferred option. I am a fan of Googling things, and it did show statistics in various reports that came up, showed that even in North America, which would have been previously, they would have been very keen on making verbal telephone reports. That's been dropping over the years, and people are more comfortable with making reports online. They feel more secure, and they feel it protects their anonymity. So that's why we went with that, as well as the other issues that had arisen before. And we didn't just look at a digital platform. We thought about whether we would get a third-party kind of ombudsman, a legal firm that people could contact feeling safe. But it just didn't really fit, given our expectation that there wouldn't be a huge number of calls, given that we're a global organization and it could be managed in-house. We were happy to go with a digital platform.
Yeah, understood. That's the experience we find with a lot of our clients too. So you've explained the reasons for changing from your previous system, and you described a little bit the process you went through in choosing a new system. Perhaps we can now explore the steps you went through in implementing the system within Fexco, and perhaps also share some tips that other organisations could apply.
I think it shouldn't be underestimated the work involved in implementing a system. But at the same time, you don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. But with any of this, it's always useful to have someone with a bit of project management experience. You may not necessarily need a project manager running it, but it's useful just to maintain an action tracker, make sure you have overall management buy-in, and that you've got senior people who are sponsoring it. There are elements of it that you do have to reach out to other people in the organisation, such as there's a privacy policy included in ours. So making sure that that's okay. We ask the in-house regulatory solicitor to have a look at it. And I think one of the most useful things we did was we ran a pilot group, and that wasn't just with people who were compliance professionals, that was the people who we would expect to be the users, who wouldn't have experience of the terminology or the, and who would find the system user-friendly. That was important to us.
And there's a question actually that's...
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, carry on, Rachel.
One of the final steps that, because of what we had learned when we reached out to the different areas, we did find with a change in personnel, there was a lack of awareness. So we involved the marketing team. Now, we're lucky enough to have a marketing team, but even if you don't, I think some kind of communication plan is essential. And having that in a number of different ways, that was definitely one of our big learnings, because I really felt like there wasn't an awareness throughout the organization. And we felt with implementing a new system, it was a great opportunity to revamp the communications. So things like posters, posting it on the internal website and sending out emails, and also referencing it in different policies, not just the whistleblowing policy, but things like the code of conduct. So you had various touch points, so it became more familiar to people.
You mentioned the pilot process you went through. There's a question just come in from the audience, actually, and just a reminder to everybody joining, you can enter any questions into the panel, and we'll get to as many as we can through the discussion. But this question is around the key stakeholders you involved in the process, and who would you recommend you involve to ensure success?
I think there are people with experience. I think most organizations have someone who is particularly good at finding fault, in terms of IT or user experience. And that was useful. But it was also useful to get people who were not at a senior level to play around with the system and see how comfortable with it. And one of the feedbacks from that was really useful, because we're concerned about security and keeping things anonymous. But on the first iteration, we had marked a number of fields mandatory, and that doesn't make people feel comfortable, because it feels like you can identify them. So we had not only the country, but the division, and maybe something else that made them feel like, actually, if I put in all that detail, there's no point. You'd pinpoint who made the complaint. Now, again, we have a non-retaliation policy, and that is emphasized everywhere, that once it's a genuine concern, don't be concerned that anyone is going to take action against you if it turns out not to be true. But we reduced down the number of mandatory fields as a result of that pilot process. And now the only one we have is country as mandatory, and that's purely because legislation in different jurisdictions may mean that we have to report something to a regulator. And that's the only one we have made mandatory.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Our recommendation is always to keep the reporting screen simple, not require people to enter too much information, because the more you require them to input, the more barriers you're putting in place to them submitting a report. And through the anonymous function, you can typically gather additional information from a whistleblower once they've reported. So you're about a year in, I think, from implementing the system, there or thereabouts. So have you been able to measure how successful the change has been, and what lessons you've learned as a result?
I suppose, the obvious thing is, have we been getting reports now? And we have gotten reports now, but we had always we had different contact points in terms of our whistleblowing policy, had a number of senior management that you could contact instead of your line manager. So we always hoped that culturally people felt safe in speaking up. So yes, we've had reports, but I just think the main thing is the level of awareness. I feel much more comfortable now. We haven't issued a survey group wide, but we have reached out to individual areas and people of different levels and asked those questions. Are you aware that there is a whistleblowing policy in place? Do you know that there's a system? Would you feel safe to use it? And that has been good. And we have done a number of kind of training sessions in relation to it as well, which I think has helped. So yeah, I think they have been, shown that it's been worthwhile doing it. And the other thing we have found is, feedback. People have said whistleblowing has kind of negative connotations. So we have changed our speak around that to speaking up and making sure that managers listen up as well. So,
did you have any feedback about, for those people who are used to the system, about the you dropping the phone lines? Was there sort of any negative?
No,
impact on that?
It's been positive. I think people are nowadays just quite comfortable with using online or phones. Now, we do have in the instructions, if you feel more comfortable, don't use your work computer, etc. Your anonymity is protected. But the other thing we have found that I did see somewhere that 50% on average of reports are anonymous, but we have found that people might start off being anonymous, but when you engage with them, they actually have felt comfortable in saying who they are and explaining a bit more, which I think is very positive.
There's a question that's coming from the audience, so I'll ask that now. It's as a global company, how did you combat the issues with different jurisdictions, especially in the EU, with debates and arguments around local reporting?
Yeah, we have put that up front and centre, saying that it is confidential, but we have obligations to report to designated authorities in certain jurisdictions. And we have a response plan if issues come in, where we do consult with the legal department to see if things need to be moved up and escalated and alerted to particular authorities within the regions. To be honest, our legal function rests in Ireland and would have expertise really in Ireland and England, but they do have contacts in other jurisdictions who they would leverage off if required.
We discussed this quite a bit in the first two webinars in the series, and there's clearly still a degree of sort of lack of clarity around local versus centralised reporting in the EU directive, which I guess will become clearer as individual jurisdictions transpose it into local legislation. So we've got quite a few.
Sorry.
Yeah, along with most of the EU, I think. Yeah. So thanks, Rachel. I think that was some sort of really interesting insights into the process that you went through within Fexco. We're getting quite a few questions from the audience coming in, so I'd like to turn to these now and get through the ones that we can over the remaining 10 minutes or so. One question is, how do you make sure that the report is really anonymous?
Yeah, that was something we emphasised in the training as well to people, because, it's that whole, it is hosted by a third party, and we have made every effort to make sure the questions aren't too precise. There is a box to put your concern, and then there's further detail if required. And also the system we use, we are now obliged to update people in terms of progress of their report. People can set up their own box with their own PIN, and it is on them to come back and revisit them. So we're not communicating outwards. They have to log back into the system using details that they included themselves, which again protects their privacy.
And do you find that the majority of people who do report anonymously do go back in via the method you have available to check for updates and provide additional information?
We actually haven't. I did read somewhere that the average, again, because we were a bit surprised that the system hadn't been used. It had been maintained by a different area. So when it got handed over to us, you would expect that even a couple of minor issues might have come through, or it would have been used in some. So I have been looking to see what is the average number of reports you can expect, and apparently it is roughly 34 per company per year. Now, I presume that depends on the size of the company. We haven't had that level of reports made, but it has had more engagement, and we do feel people are happier coming forward. And yes, we have gone back to people and even gotten a thank you just to say, but there is limits in the information you can report back to them. So at times you feel you're not able to explain the full actions that were taken, but we are doing our best to keep people updated so that they know that they are being listened to.
I don't want you to disclose any sensitivities, but if you can, in roughly sort of what types of reports are you getting predominantly into the system? If you're comfortable in sharing.
Yeah, no, you're fine. We have actually in our whistleblowing policy, HR grievances are actually excluded. There is a different method why people should raise those. So it has been concerns about kind of control issues or not complying with policy. And again, like, they haven't been on the severe scale, but it's been useful to know, and it points again to the culture that people are comfortable speaking up and that an issue doesn't become endemic. If people aren't following particular policies and that becomes habitual, it kind of loses its meaning.
You touched on the importance of communication and what you did within Fexco. We've had a couple of questions coming in on a similar theme. It's around developing trust in the system. So clearly you can have the best system in the world, but if people aren't aware of it or they're not confident that they can use it without fear of retaliation or recrimination, it's not going to be used as much as it should. So one question from the audience is from somebody who's found themselves victimized or penalized as a result of making a whistleblowing report within their organization, to the extent to which they found it difficult to get a role since then. Their question is, how can we encourage more people to speak up when faced with potentially immense personal risk? And then the second question on a similar theme is, what have you done to develop trust in the system within Fexco, and that staff have confidence in using it?
I did speak to a gentleman from another organisation previously, and he had said that they keep in contact with HR and make sure that they are also his particular compliance department. They speak, they do termination interviews, so there is an opportunity when someone has left as such or is leaving for them to come up with any issues. But obviously you would want it dealt with before that. We haven't had anything so serious as yet, but I am hoping to do a session next year to say these are the types of issues that have come up, these are how they've been dealt with, to ensure people understand that stuff is arising and that it is being dealt with. Yeah, and we are continuing just to keep that awareness going and that training going to ensure people are comfortable, and emphasize that non-retaliation issue, and that if they have any concerns that there has been retaliation, that they are comfortable coming forward to our HR department and feel protected, because they should be. That defeats the whole purpose if you're not protected.
And I think you put that information on the reporting portal itself as well, just so that there was guidance around trying to reassure people that they could report confidentiality. Yeah,
and again we have posters up, and we have done a campaign on our internal website.
Another question that's come in: what's the most common failing in implementing, or what's a worst case scenario of implementing, I guess, and how would you suggest people can avoid them?
I think based on our learnings from previously, it's implementing it and then forgetting about it. Just assuming your job is done once it's implemented. I think it has to be an iterative process, and you have to continue to raise awareness and make sure people are happy to use the system, and that training and continuous awareness just shouldn't stop.
Can you talk for a minute? We're getting towards the end of the session, but can you talk for a couple of minutes around what happens when you make a report? And just a reminder for the audience that next week's webinar will focus on the investigative process in more detail. We're going to be joined by Annabel Kearney, a partner at Stone Turn, who will talk through how to make your investigations successful. you can register using the link provided. But within Fexco, Rachel, how do you handle investigations?
We have a couple of administrators, so they get notified if a report comes in. It's reviewed. You could almost say triaged, in terms of the level of complaint it is. We have a response plan laid out, and depending on the level of concern, it depends on how big the investigation team is. We kind of set the clock at that point to make sure that we respond within a timely basis to the whistleblower, and we do tend to try and include any questions at that point rather than having to go back, more than once. So the first communication, to acknowledge it, thank you, we've received it, and we will come back with any questions, and then as many as concise questions as required are included, and then a close-up. If the investigation, once it's closed, we update the system again.
Great, thanks. I'm getting to the end of time, so I don't think we're going to be able to deal with other questions that have come in. We've covered most of them, I think. Others are variations on a theme. But before we close, what one message would you leave for the audience to walk away with from your experience?
I know I've said it already, but I really can't emphasize it enough. It is, implementing it is one step of the process, but I think the most important thing is communicating around it and making sure that awareness continues, because that is what we learned, that we had previously implemented a system, there were kinks in the system, and it wasn't being used. And I think that if there is one thing that people can do is to make sure that they continue to communicate and ensure awareness of the system, so that people actually use it.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So I think we're just about up to time, so that's it for today. But thank you very much for sharing your experience and thoughts with us today, Rachel. Certainly I found it insightful and interesting, and I hope our audience did as well. Thanks also to everyone else for participating in this event and for the questions you've submitted. We hope you can join us at the same time next week to talk through the investigations process in a bit more detail. And finally, we'd really welcome your feedback on today's event by taking no more than 30 seconds just to complete a short survey that you should see on your screen now. And this is really helpful in helping us to shape and form future events that we run. So thanks to all of you once again. Many thanks to you, Rachel. Hope to see everybody again next week. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.